Alberto Manguel is a writer, translator, editor, and critic, but would rather define himself as a reader and a lover of books. Born in Buenos Aires, he has since resided in Israel, Argentina, Europe, the South Pacific, Canada, and most recently New York. He was the director of the National Library of Argentina from 2016 to 2018. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you.
We're here to talk about your most recent book, Packing My Library, an elegy and 10 digressions. You start off in France, where you acquired a beautiful ancient barn to house your 30 to 40,000 books. Could you describe that barn for us, please?
We were looking for a place to house the library. We started looking in Canada, but in a city, a property as large as that is inconceivably expensive. And we couldn't live out in the country because I don't drive. So we started looking in France, where we had lived before. And then I was invited to Poitiers to give a talk. And I discovered an area that I loved, where the real estate was cheap and has beautiful Romanesque architecture. So we were offered castles and manors and mills and what have you. And ambitiously, I said you wouldn't have a monastery. And the real estate agent said, well, we don't have a monastery right now, but we have a presbytery, a manse. And he took us to see it, and I fell in love with the place. It was a building that had begun in the 13th century. It was attached to 11th, 12th century church. We had the stained glass windows overlooking the garden. It had a huge garden and had an orchard and the barn. It was a stone barn that had been built around 1400, and part of it had been demolished over the years, but the stones were still there. So an architect friend who lived in the village castle supervised the construction, and we had an extraordinary place to lodge the library. It became iconic. There were documentaries made about it, and
was it your dream fulfilled, or is that too
it
big?
was more than my dream. I always dreamt of having all my different libraries collected in one place, but I imagined a normal space like a storage room with shelves, and this was a beautiful stone building with a tower at each end and wooden beams.
Sounds like Montaigne's tower.
Well, Montaigne's tower was circular, and it was just a tower. We had this beautiful rectangle and two towers. I had my office in one, and my partner had his office in his. And I spent most of my time there reading in the library itself, which was the main building, and working in my tower. And it was paradise, but it's in the nature of paradise that you lose it. That's how you know it's paradise.
You mentioned that the most valuable books to you were the ones that had private association copies.
Quite. I don't have enough money to be a bibliophile.
You don't need a lot of money to be a bibliophile.
Well, you do if you want to be a professional bibliophile. You can't buy a Gutenberg library on what you earn as a freelance writer. But I had several quite valuable books in the library, but the ones that I cared most for were the ones that were association copies for very private reasons. The the copy of Storky and Company, Kipling's stories that Borges gave me when I left Argentina as an adolescent after reading for him for several years.
What did he say in it? Anything in particular?
Nothing. No, he didn't.
Just
write
signed
in
it?
No, he didn't. No, I know that it's the copy that
Yes.
he gave me,
Yes.
which he read in his adolescence. And then there was a copy of Marie Chapdelaine, the first edition, that was given to me when I became a Canadian citizen, and which for me is emblematic of this beloved country, because it was this Quebecois novel written by a Frenchman, read by Timothy Eaton in the Savoy Hotel, and only read halfway through. So it really indicates for me the relationship between these two cultures in Canada.
There's an early Blake translation, and then there's another one that Thoreau MacDonald illustrated. There's no illustrations, there's no woodcuts.
It was the first French edition.
Of course,
Yes.
because you speak 3 or 4 different languages, right?
5, yes.
5, yeah.
And Timothy Eaton was trying to read it in the original French, that I find quite moving.
Yeah, and the sections of the library were determined by a language.
Yes, because it was a private library, I could arrange the books in any way I wanted. So the major divisions were by the language in which the book was originally written. So if I had a German translation of Flaubert, it would still be in the French language section. But there were dozens of exceptions. I had all my books of theology separate, my books on the Quran. Dante occupied a different section. Detective novels had a whole room. It was called the murder room in the house, and so on.
You collected detective novels, but not very many spy stories.
I don't like spy stories, with few exceptions. I love The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. I think it is a great novel about the lack of morals of our time. But otherwise, I like the detective novel for the pure puzzle. I like the novels of the 30s, and then some writers of later years, like Reginald Hill or James McClure. I think they're great novelists and also great puzzle makers.
Borges, of course, was a great fan of the detective novel.
He was, and he introduced the genre into the Spanish language. He created with his friend Bioy Casares a series called The Seventh Circle, referring to Dantes' circles, which is a circle of the murderers. And it became hugely successful in the Spanish language. And it published great detective story writers such as John Dixon Carr and Margaret Millar, but also classics like Dickens's The Mystery of Edwin Drood and a novel by Chekhov, which can be read as a detective novel, and The Moonstone, Wilkie Collins, and so on. And he inspired several generations of Spanish language writers. As you know, the detective novel genre has become a literary genre in Argentina, and some of the best Spanish language writers, I think in everywhere in the world, have taken the detective novel as the basic structure of their fiction. Mm-hmm. And that is all thanks to Borges.
Yeah, in fact, after we talk, I'm going to be meeting with Claudia
Piñero.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, yes. And see, well, what Borges helped writers recognize is that much of the essential stories of our different literatures have a detective novel structure. I was amused to discover that when Gallimard's detective series, La Collection Noire, celebrated its 100th title was Oedipus Rex, which is a detective novel.
Yeah. Quite a horrific twist.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting you should mention Borges as championing the detective novel, which relies on logic as much as anything.
Quite.
And yet he was also responsible, or at least some people have suggested that he was one of the early champions, again, of this mystical approach to writing, where fantasy comes in and it's not rejected by the logic.
I think that an important distinction has to be made, and it's easier to make it in English than in Spanish. In English, you have a distinction between the fantastic and the supernatural, the uncanny, the weird. Borges was interested in those latter categories. He was interested in the uncanny, breaking into reality, showing us that the life that we see as normal, the quotidian in the universe, has a side that cannot be explained, what someone called deference to the mystery. It's not about prancing unicorns and fire-breathing dragons, but instead it's something that happens and that cannot be fully explained by, as Borges says, the word chance or conventional explanations such as he was mad, it was all a dream, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's a cop-out, really.
It's
especially
a cop-out, and the reader in those stories knows that there is something else. Borges was interested in that, and his stories are always logical, and they don't allow for the appearance of fairies or goblins or that sort of thing. He wasn't interested in that. He loathed talking.
Yeah.
While he had a great admiration for Anglo-Saxon literature.
But there is a much more of an appetite for the kind of weird, inexplicable in South American literature.
Oh, yes.
And the readers are more apt to suspend their disbelief.
Yes, I think that because the history of the countries of Latin America, very different histories and that evolve in different ways of telling the stories, have all a clear perception of the unexpected constantly happening. A rational mind cannot look at Argentinian politics or Venezuelan politics and pretend to understand what is happening. And that creates an interest not in what I would call the superficial fantasy, things that Garcia Marquez describes of somebody breeding butterflies in her mouth, or the river turning red, or so on. But a metaphysical, philosophical mystery, an existential mystery. And so these profound questions appear in Latin American fiction always. Curiously, not in the literature of Spain, but in the literature of the South American countries, whether it's the Cuban Virgilio Piñera, whether it is the Peruvian Arguedas, whether it is the Uruguayan Feliberto Hernandez, in Argentina, Cortázar, Bioy, and Borges, and Silvino Campo, and so on. They were all interested in what happens when documentary reality shows its cracks. What do you see through those cracks?
Well, and you mentioned psychology, and there seems to be quite an emphasis on that in the books that are written by, particularly Argentinian.
Not in the case of Borges.
No, but
psychology has contaminated the Argentinian mental landscape because it has become the most common profession. There is no one in Buenos Aires who doesn't see a psychoanalyst or is a psychoanalyst.
Yes.
Borges derided that. He made fun of Freud, and he had an interest in the psychology of Jung and Jung's ideas, but Borges very clearly states in the preface to one of his collections of fiction that he says these stories don't intend to be psychological. Psychology, or what we call psychological take on fiction, appears in many writers, but I wouldn't say that with certain exceptions like Jorge Volpi in Mexico, or even Claudia Piñero in Argentina, with those exceptions, psychology is not at the forefront of fiction.
Okay. I was just amused to learn that in Buenos Aires there's more bookstores per capita in the world, the most bookstores per capita in the world, and the most psychiatrists.
Yes, I think that the bookstores counteract the noxious effects of Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis.
I was amused to read that you kept an ample supply of bad books in case you needed examples of the same in your library.
Well, the policy in the library was not to let any book go. Any book that came into the library stayed, with one exception that I will talk about. So I have in the library, the collection still exists, even if it's in boxes.
In Montreal here. Right?
In Montreal,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. Examples of bad books. Since I write about writing and reading, I need examples of bad books.
Yes. Shortly after that observation, you say, an obsession is a pleasure that has attained the status of an idea.
That's a quote, yes.
Yeah. Do you remember who said that?
No.
Do you remember, do you have any idea what exactly they're talking about?
Yes, of course, yes. When you become obsessed with something, that obsession becomes part of your taste, of your way of thinking, modifies and colors your opinions about almost anything. So I am very aware that since my obsession are books, I see books everywhere because I look for books everywhere.
Yeah.
So whenever I'm traveling, I know that I can leave with an empty suitcase, but come back with a suitcase full of books, if not two.
Mm-hmm. I've actually had to empty out my suitcases because they've been too heavy at the airport.
Quite.
So, yeah.
So yes, the obsession takes over, but I think it is a healthy obsession. Valéry Larbaud called it the unpunished vice.
Books were part of who I was.
They still are. A library is an autobiography. I can tell my life through the books that I have read and the books that I have collected. For somebody who loves reading and who has discovered the world through books, books are the incarnation of yourself. I find myself represented and exposed in books, even those I haven't read. So when I lost my library, it was as if somebody had amputated an arm and a leg and torn my tongue out and made me blind.
You didn't lose it, you just had to store it. But you lost the physical...
Yeah, the feeling is like that of having phantom limbs. They are not there, but I feel them. and I think about them every moment of the day, and when I'm working, I reach out to a shelf that is no longer there and try to embrace the ghosts, as Dante does when he sees his friend Casella on the shore of Purgatory. You hug something that is not there.
Yeah. I have books in storage, and I'll be thinking about a topic or something will come up, and I'll be upset because I can't go and reach to the book.
Fortunately, my memory is quite good for books, not for anything else. So I remember books that I have read, and so now for the past 5 years I've been writing out of the library in my mind. Sometimes I have to check some references in a public library, but mostly I write with what I remember, and I'm very surprised to see how much I remember. So it's still there.
That's what they were concerned about when writing was invented, which our memories would go to.
Yeah, that's the myth that Plato tells in through Socrates, when the Egyptian god Thoth offers the gift of writing to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says, well, I don't want it because we will lose our memory that way.
Yeah.
I think there's something true in that, because we rely on these different instruments that our technologies produce as an extension of our capabilities, but at the same time they can replace those capabilities, and the muscle atrophies, as we are seeing now with the electronic technology, where there are movements to stop the teaching of handwriting in schools and teach mathematics in schools, since the machine can do that, without understanding that the machines can do that because we can do that. It's a way of helping us and freeing up time for more creative activities, but that without those capabilities, without those muscles, we will no longer be able to think imaginatively. I think what's happening politically around the world is a consequence of that reliance on the instrument and the shedding of responsibilities and obligations towards those activities.
Yeah, Samuel Johnson talked about two types of knowledge: the stuff that's in your head and you knowing where to get that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the latter seems to be
absolutely expanded. Seneca said it very briefly, the accumulation of knowledge is not knowledge. There is also always an active component of these abstract notions, knowledge, justice, and so on. They can exist, but what matters is the possibility of you accessing them and knowing how to access them.
You mentioned libraries a moment ago. I like what you say about the fact that you like to write in the margins of books. You like to own the books. You don't like to wait for books.
Yes. No,
that explains the kind of the collector, the acquisitive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I have a very physical relationship with my books. So I always write in my books. I always put papers and notes in the books, and I need to own the book. So I love public libraries, but I can't read comfortably in a public library because I want to take the book home with me.
Yes.
I don't like one-night stands.
Yeah, they're not that fulfilling, are they? Yeah, I want materiality, the solid presence of books.
Yes. Yeah, there's nothing against reading on a screen. I'm not a technophobe. It's just a question of private pleasure. I like the material presence of the books in my library. I like to feel surrounded by those books, even if I know that many of them I won't read. I have opened all the books in my library. I've opened those 35,000, 40,000 books.
Yeah.
Obviously, I haven't read them all from the first to the last page. But books are like that. I mean, they are not all meant to be read by every reader.
Mm-hmm. And they're not necessarily meant to be read all the way through.
Quite.
You can dip in and out, and
Yes.
if it's boring, then why are you going to waste your time with it?
Yes, or for many other reasons. I don't think we should ever read because we feel obliged to read.
Mm-hmm.
Borges said that reading cannot be obligatory because happiness cannot be obligatory.
Well, and again, I'm a fan of Johnson, so he said something along the lines of you shouldn't force yourself to read anything.
No, quite.
You should follow your own inclination.
Absolutely, and that's what he did himself.
Petra, you quote Petrarch as saying, "I feel that I never have enough books."
Yeah.
You feel that way?
Oh yes, of course. But then a library can be defined as the space that's always too small for the books that are allotted to it. So it's an endless quest, but I like endless quests.
Mm-hmm. Well, it keeps you living, keeps you wanting to stay alive.
Yeah. I don't like the light at the end of the tunnel. I like the tunnel.
This is a quote that came shortly after Petrarch. He said, "We exist only when we interact with someone else.
Yeah.
The search for others establishes our own identity."
Mm.
So how come you're spending so much time with books instead of people?
But books are the others. Books are the experience of others. Books are the voice of others. Quevedo,
They don't talk back, though.
they talk back. Absolutely, they talk back. Quevedo called that conversations with the dead, and the dead talk back to you. I can be reading Jane Eyre and then have an opinion on something, and then I find a response to my opinion in Jane Eyre.
But if you've got a question about the book,
Mm-hmm.
you can read it as many times as you want. And maybe your own mind will come up with a new interpretation,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not going to talk back to you with an answer that you want.
Well, first of all, I don't read to find answers. I read to find better questions. And those questions always appear in the books that I love. I have never finished reading the Divine Comedy, even if I've read it now, 200 times, or Quixote or King Lear. There's always something more that the book tells me. And that doesn't happen when I talk to friends, to people. People change their minds and say different things and can come up with new ideas. But a book that touches us in depth, that becomes essential for us, with the same words, keeps digging and going deeper and deeper and revealing more to us that we never knew was there, even with the same words.
Yeah, you're in touch with the greater intelligence.
Yes, with the memory of humankind, with the experience of time and layers and layers of generations of readers. I find it miraculous that the human species has been able to develop its imagination into the act of narration, and those narrations, those stories, can be so endlessly enriching.
So I take it you don't agree with Berkeley when he says to be is to be perceived.
But yes, to be is to be perceived, but it's being perceived by the books. My books know that I'm there and establish a communication with me that never ends. And the book, the text, exists because I perceive it, because I read it. It's mutually beneficial, the act of reading. I help the books achieve immortality, and the books help me understand myself.
I can tell you've done a bit of thinking about this.
Yes, it's been 71 years.
Yeah, I love this as well. You love public libraries, as you've said. The first place you visit when you go to a new city is a public library,
Quite.
a city that you don't know. But you can only work happily in your own private library with
Yes.
your own books.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm also a fetishist. I need my desk to be laid out in a certain way and things arranged in a certain way, and only when that happens, that first part of the ritual, I can start to work.
Right. You quote Walter Benjamin, who says that a collector is pulled between the poles of disorder and order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you want to order your collection so that it acquires a semantic sense, but at the same time you keep pulling it apart because you want certain individual objects of books, you want to add to that. So there is a tension between the impulse towards chaos and the impulse towards order in every collector.
Yeah. Well, and when you've got a collection, there's all sorts of little arteries that you can kind of funnel
Absolutely,
off in. And,
yes, yes. You keep diverting.
Of course, he had the famous essay about unpacking his books.
Yeah, which came because he had to move, he had divorced, and so his books accompanied him into a new space. And I called my book Unpacking My Library because of Benjamin's essay, because I thought this is the contrary impulse. Unpacking is...
You called yours Packing My Library.
Packing My Library,
Yeah.
and his was Unpacking My Library.
Yeah.
And when he unpacked his library, he was giving the books a new life. And I, packing my library, I felt that I was burying them prematurely.
Yeah, you talk about playing a film backwards, voluntarily forgetting,
Yeah.
whereas unpacking is like a rebirth.
Yeah. You bring them to light.
Yeah. And unpacking stimulates images and memories, but not thought.
Yes, I think it doesn't give you time to do much thinking because it's all present.
Yeah.
While when you are packing, because you're putting those books away, you're thinking about them, and the associations you make about the remembered readings are your own, and they elicit new thoughts. It's what happens at a funeral. If you have a friend that you dearly love, during the conversations there could be an activity around what happens in the moment. But once the friend is dead, once the friend is buried, then the friend will live in your thoughts, in your memories. You have to actively bring that person, that book back.
Yeah, speaking of which, you talk about packing your books up as a premature burial. I guess the reason that you packed up your books and left was sordid bureaucracy.
Yeah, one doesn't have to go into the details, but I was very happy for 15 years in this place in France, and I really thought that I would die there. I would be carried out. I wouldn't leave the place.
Yeah.
But bureaucracy happened, which is the curse of every one of our societies. This obligation to waste your time in paperwork, in following senseless rules that are supposed to order society, but instead complicate it. My business is not to fill in forms. My business is not to indulge in paperwork. My business is something else, and you shouldn't ask a mason, a carpenter, a brain surgeon, a cook to spend time with these things. If society needs them, society should find a way of developing it automatically. We've been almost for 100 years now in the electronic age. How is it possible that we still have to spend all this time with idiotic forms? And I got fed up with it, and it became so impossible that we decided to leave. I was offered a teaching position at Princeton and at Columbia, and so we left for New York, and life went on, but my books were buried.
Yeah, one of the images that I love is you talk about taking a coffee out in the morning and just sitting there in the sunshine. And
yeah, that was my ritual. We had a wonderful dog, and I would get up very early in the morning. I wake up at 5:30, and sort of wander half asleep into the kitchen, make myself a tea. The dog would come with me. I would go out into the garden and sit on the bench and see the sunrise above the fruit trees at the end of the garden, and the only sound was that of the birds waking up. That was bliss. That was paradise.
yeah, it's tough to leave that.
Yes, it's as if you had an arm cut off.
Yeah. Having lost his books as objects, Don Quixote rebuilds his library in his mind and finds in the remembered pages the source of renewed strength.
Yes, it's interesting. I didn't realize we were talking about when the book talks back to you and you discover more questions that you hadn't seen. I have read Don Quixote dozens of times, and I had never remarked on this curious thing that once his niece and the governess tell him that a sorcerer came at night and made the library disappear, that they've walled it in and burned many of the books. Don Quixote doesn't say anything. He goes into his room for 3 days, and then when he emerges, he goes on his first adventure with Sancho Panza and never picks up a book again. His ethics, his mission in life as Don Quixote, he becomes Don Quixote because of his readings. But once his library disappears, he decides to act in the world and carry the memory of his readings, the ethics of chivalry in his mind. And I felt something similar happened to me when I packed the books up. I went to New York and then was offered the post of director of the National Library of Argentina, and I thought, well, now I have to enter the kitchen or go out into the world as Don Quixote did and put into practice what my books have taught me, but I don't have those books anymore. So that's what happened. In a way, it's salutary, but I still regret having to have been forced to do it.
The building, the National Library of Argentina, Borges said it looked like a hideous sewing machine.
Yeah, it's a horrible building. It was lodged in a beautiful 19th century palazzo, and then it moved for reasons of space, to this atrocious, brutalist building built by Clorindo Testa, a man who said that his mission in life was to redeem ugliness, and he certainly succeeded as far as the library is concerned. And it's built by a person who doesn't know what a library is or should be, doesn't know how you use books, because most of the library, this tower, has the feeling of a dungeon, very low ceilings, ugly cement. There are places where you want to commit suicide. Only the reading rooms on the 5th and 6th floor with a view to the river have a certain charm. But even there, he didn't care about how to wash the windows. So the windows are grimy, and there is no way of cleaning it except paying a fortune to mountain climbers who can come and do the job from time to time. But because the library doesn't have the budget for it, the windows are grimy, so you see through a glass darkly.
Yeah, when I was there recently, the place looked kind of shabby and unkempt.
It is. But then the Argentinian government doesn't care a fig for culture, so if it crumbled tomorrow, they wouldn't shed a single tear.
On page 129 of Packing My Library, speaking of the role of a national library, you say, why is it in most of our societies citizens lack an effective political voice? Citizens must react to injustice by turning a blind eye or by committing violence.
No, that question remains, and it's a question that's asked throughout literature, of course. How do you react to Richard III? How do you react to tyrant banderas of Valle Inclán? How do you react to, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the citizens complain about the evil king who has to learn empathy.
Well, Macbeth killing the king.
Absolutely. So I think a national library has a role to fulfill in that sense. It can educate its citizens in civic duties. It can be a place where the evidence of the history of the society can be exposed, and people can come and check documents and find out what they are about. But that role has to be actively encouraged, and in Argentina it is not. In very few societies it is, because it makes governments uncomfortable to have citizens who can think and who can ask intelligent questions.
We need that more now than ever in democracies, in Western democracies.
Look what happened in Canada. Canada, with the best intentions, as an example for the world, Trudeau's government puts people representing minorities in place, and these people react without any sense of their political responsibility. The Minister of Justice, the indigenous woman who was named to that post because of Trudeau's policies, turned against him without understanding that in the Conservative government she wouldn't be allowed to clean the doorstep. And she is committing social suicide by taking this righteous position. Well, I will not allow the question of infringement of power to arise. Well, then don't go into politics. Don't go into politics. If you want to preserve a virginal purity of the untouched maiden mind, then go get yourself into a nunnery and don't become Minister of Justice. And she will ruin the country for all of us now, because she undermines Trudeau's policies and will get a conservative government who will lower its pants for Trump.
I disagree. I think she showed principle.
You can show principle together with responsibility.
She didn't kowtow to cronyism.
It wasn't cronyism. It was a political question of saying, can we afford to lose 10,000 jobs in Quebec? Trudeau didn't say to her, you have to sweep this under the carpet. He said, we need to look at this and find a solution. And if you take a pure ethical stance to say the question cannot be posed, you would lose. You have to understand that you are in politics, and politics is murky business.
The role of the Attorney General is to uphold the rule of law, and that's what she did.
Absolutely, but not to uphold it unconsciously.
She knew exactly what she was doing.
Well, then she is an idiot. Then she is, I have even less respect for her. If she upholds the rule of law saying...
It's what our whole society is based on.
And the price is that we will lose our democracy in Canada, then she's an idiot.
She's maintaining our democracy.
She won't maintain it if the Conservatives come in.
No, it's democracy. It's not that she's destroying it. It's sad. I don't want the Conservatives in either.
So you would maintain your principle and...
Trudeau lied about this whole thing.
But you lose the possibility of doing everything that a humanitarian society should do. Ethical questions.
I don't know if it's black and white like that.
Ethical questions are not black and white, which is what she should have understood. Ethical questions imply all the consequences.
You're either honest or you're not honest.
No, that's black and white. And
yeah, it is.
I don't agree.
It is
I
black
don't
and
agree.
white.
Honesty has shades. If you say that every murderer should be executed in a society that has the death penalty, you are putting all the cases together in a situation where you have, you could be defending something, there are circumstances that say constantly, there but for the grace of God go I. You have to adapt your
It's not about honesty, though.
concerns.
You're confusing honesty with following regulations. She just told the truth, that's all.
No, she didn't tell the truth. That's it. She didn't tell the truth. She didn't say, the Prime Minister simply asked me whether we could consider the question. She said, interference and so on.
Well, that's what happened.
But it wasn't. Okay, well, let's... no.
Okay, but let's use
the
this...
consequences. If she had read any literature, she would have understood that if you take the position of saying, I will not give an inch, you lose everything. And that's not how life happens. You can go to your...
That's what was so refreshing about it for me.
Well, then she will be celebrated in the grave with hundreds of thousands of Canadians who will lose all the stature that Justin Trudeau gave them, because with the Conservative government there will be none of that, and we will lose everything that was acquired by the Liberals.
Trudeau's done nothing on the environment. He's put up a good show, but it's all
the same
hot air.
was said about Obama. Sure, he didn't do 400 things, and now we have Trump. So you can say Justin Trudeau didn't do this and didn't fold his napkin correctly and so on.
He lied.
And now we have what will come, and we will deserve it.
Well, I'm going to vote green, and I hope that they win the election. That's a bit idealistic, but that's where I'm going.
Okay. Well, I wish you luck. I wish you luck. But having worked for almost 3 years inside the Argentinian government, I can tell you, I started off like that. I started off saying, with the corruption of the Cristina government before, I will follow every rule. I will not break a single rule and so on. Well, had I done that, I realized very soon that the library would have folded, and I would have had the hand over my chest and saying, I behaved impeccably. We have lost the library. We have lost 1,000 jobs. We have lost all this, but my conscience is clean.
You talk about the notion of, just specific to our conversation, about what is fair and unfair, and where better is this expressed and recorded than in a national library.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the library would give you the documents that would help you negotiate and find your path in what is not black and white. No important question that presents itself is black and white.
Politics is pragmatic, but the
but
point
life is pragmatic. If you're against killing someone.
I'm for telling the truth.
Okay. I am also for telling the truth, and the library is the place that tells the truth. It gives evidence.
You say that it's a storehouse of every kind of manifestation of justice.
Quite.
A catalogue of examples of just and unjust acts.
Quite.
So this is where Judy Wilson-Raybould's act will be recorded in the library.
Absolutely. And the downfall of the democratic society will be recorded in the chapter following.
I don't think the Conservative government's going to hasten the downfall of democracy in Canada.
I think it will.
I think that's a bit catastrophizing.
Well, at my age, I'm inclined to see catastrophe everywhere, but I hope you're right.
The library should be an instrument to guide readers in their civic roles.
Absolutely.
And to promote the importance of reading.
Look, I'm writing a biography of Maimonides now, and a question that comes up very early in Maimonides' career is when he is in the extremist Almohad society that wants everyone to convert to Islam or leave, if not, then not be killed. And Maimonides says, look, if your life depends on saying that you convert and mumbling a few prayers and in your heart you keep the faith in which you believe in, do it. Your life is more important than upholding publicly what is considered by you and your fellows to be the truth. I think that it makes absolute sense. Otherwise, it's a kind of moral suicide that benefits no one except the image that you have of yourself. And even that will not last for long because you will have your head chopped off.
Okay, I'm going to use your own words against you, just winding down here.
Please, that's what books do. That's why they answer back.
This is your own book. You're saying that a national library is there to record the imagining of better worlds.
Yes.
In the face of greed and corruption.
Absolutely.
So I'm big with that, but it doesn't sound like
you
absolutely.
Are. No, but absolutely. To combat greed and corruption, which would come with a conservative government.
It's already here, Alberto.
It's never not there. It's not. It's a question of degrees. Mm-hmm. That's where we have to think in terms of tension between the white and black, because you will never have that perfect society of absolute honesty. It has never happened since
It's something
the world
we
began.
want to work toward, though.
We want to work towards it, but we want to work towards it not eliminating it at the same time.
Slowly. Maybe she was too abrupt.
Slowly or gradually or what have you, but with intelligence to say, this is a straight road that I want to take, and there is a tree on the road. If I go straight, I'll crash into it, so I have to make a detour. I know where I want to go, I know how I want to get there, but I have to realize that there are obstacles in the way, and if I don't take them into consideration, I will crash, which is what she did.
So you're talking about making compromises.
I'm talking about making compromises, yes, but not every compromise. Because let's go back to the question. What Trudeau said was, we have to find a way, we have to talk about this.
He kept pressuring her to break the rules, is what he did.
No,
yes,
that's
he
not
did.
true. That's not true.
That's exactly what he did.
I have the transcripts. I have what she said he told her. And using her words, you will see that she never says that he told her, let's forgive this company, let's not fine them. He said, let's talk about it. Let's discuss it.
She objected to his political interference, and she made it clear early on that he was interfering politically in this decision which was against the rules.
Let's go to the words that he used, because you can say that you politically interfere, but you have to go to the evidence that the library would show in the transcript of the conversation. And you can see there that all he is asking is not for an immediate decision based on the law, as you suggest, but simply let's discuss it. Look, these things appear all the time when somebody kills a person who is in great suffering with that person's consent to end that person's life. The law says you can't put an end to the life of anyone. But you have to discuss it. If that person is your beloved wife who is in agony and has been in agony for years, do you say, oh, I'm not allowed to kill and let her suffer? So the cases are many. I'm taking it into something sentimental. But all I would have wanted her to say is, Prime Minister, let's sit down and talk about this. Or I will have a committee to consider this. Or I will discuss it in some way that realizing that this will cause a problem. So you can't say, I will take this decision and not see the consequences, because very well, the company is fined and the company says, now we leave Quebec. What do you do with those 10,000, or I don't know
they
how
would,
many was unemployed?
If there were other contracts, as the CEO of that company said, the employees would find work with these other companies that got the contracts.
That's all that needs to be put on the table. That's all that needs to be discussed. But it wasn't. She shut the door. She said, I won't discuss it. You are interfering. I'll make this public.
It wasn't just that. It wasn't just him. It was 11 people that were bugging her for months.
That's not how politics work.
No, that's what's so refreshing about this, for me anyway.
Oh, okay.
And it's an ideal, and I admire her for it.
Okay, all right.
But we, as you say, we may be stuck with the Tories, and I sure as hell don't want that.
Well, they have to thank her for that, because that's what essentially what will bring this government down.
And look what they did to the National Library is a bit of a disgrace in Canada right now.
Why?
Just the fact that they don't acquire the papers of important Canadian writers, and they haven't for years and years and years.
Yes, it's okay. That's a completely different question.
Yeah.
But
I mean, the thing is, the Tories would be less open to increasing funding to the
Of
National
course,
Library
of
than the
course,
Liberals.
Of course,
Right?
but then it's a problem of when the National Library of Canada was joined with the Archives, of the National Archives of Canada, lots of bureaucratic questions and
Under Sheila
administration
Copps.
and so yeah. There are no saints here, and even among the saints, there are not many that I would choose. So it's complicated, and righteousness is never the right way because it doesn't serve justice; it serves yourself.
Don't like to leave it on that. Don't like to leave it on that.
Let's leave it on.
Let's leave it on
whatever you
something.
want.
Something about books.
If we go to books, and I always go to books, you can see how in books these subjects are dealt with.
There will be some interesting books written about this, fiction and nonfiction, for sure.
I'm talking about fiction, which in some senses is richer in these areas than nonfiction. Have you read a novel by Ian McEwan called The Children's Act? In that novel, the moral dilemma is a judge has to decide whether a 17-year-old boy should have be forced to have a blood transfusion. His parents are Seventh-day Adventists, and the boy is a believer in that, and he doesn't want the transfusion. Without the transfusion, he will die. So the judge has to decide. He's almost an adult, but not quite, and she decides that he will have the transfusion. So the consequences of that are in the novel, and you see that it doesn't work out perfectly just because she says, well, we have to save this life. Fiction shows you up to what point these moral dilemmas are complex, and if you choose to go the way of absolute justice and absolute truth, you don't succeed in absolute justice and absolute truth.
Yeah.
This is what Don Quixote finds out. Don Quixote, in his first adventure, he sees a young boy tied to a tree and his master whipping him, and he gets him to stop, and the master doesn't want to pay the boy, which is why he's whipping him. And he makes him promise that under the law of chivalry he will pay him and let him go free. And the boy, knowing perfectly well that that won't happen, he says, oh, please don't, And so when Don Quixote meets the boy long after with Sancho, the boy, now grown, says, please, if you find me in trouble again, please don't do anything. Please don't do anything. Cervantes doesn't solve it for you. He tells you Don Quixote has an idea of perfect justice which comes from novels of chivalry. He has to do this.
He's noble.
He's noble, he's ethical. He has, he says many times, he talks about the sense of justice. But at the same time, Cervantes shows you that
he's a laughingstock.
Well, that is not as important in my view. The fact that what Don Quixote gratifies is his private sense of justice, which is the ethics of chivalry. But the consequences of that are nefarious for the person that he helps. This is a dilemma that we face every day. We face it with tiny things, we face it with huge things, like the Minister of Justice had to face. And we have to go beyond the immediate act of justice, the immediate ethical act, and say, what are the consequences? Mm-hmm. And so if the result is that I come out of this saying, what a great guy I am, I have acted according to my principles.
But she's not the only person that thinks that. I think that too.
Okay.
And a lot of people think that.
Okay, sure. and what do you think about the consequences?
Yeah.
Let me ask you, let's have this conversation in 3 years' time and see what the conservative government has done and what is the position of native people in that government and how many women and how many minorities are represented as a consequence of this.
Yeah.
So this is an act of justice, it's fine, and these are the consequences. And let's see.
And that's what fiction does
have
too, doesn't it? I mean, you could write a novel. It's a test run. You can see in fiction. I mean, that's what storytelling is about. Is sort of testing all sorts of possibilities.
Absolutely. And curiously, I think of this now. The only fiction that has immediate good actions result in a better world are these little moralistic tracts of the Victorian times that nobody believes in and are not good literature. Why is that? Because the reader doesn't feel they are true.
Look what happens to Cordelia, too.
Look what happens to Cordelia. Look what happens to Dorothea in Middlemarch. Look what happens to these wonderful characters that do the right thing. Well, Hamlet says this, that it's the greatest treason to do the right thing for the wrong reason. So I think that literature is a guide there, as not as to what to do, but how complex it is to do what you think is right.
I'll just finally give you how you end your book.
Okay.
In the end is my beginning. That's what Mary Queen of Scots said, and that's the motto for your library. Can you just finally expand on that a bit?
As fiction tells us that at the end of the book is the beginning of another book, it's you start as a reader to reflect on what you have read, and you don't need to go to circular books like Finnegan's Wake to do this. You can have Huckleberry Finn, and at the end you begin it again with another understanding of the world. I feel the same thing with my library. My library is now in boxes here stored in the storage room that my publisher gave me for free. But a new life has begun for these books. In my mind, I write through them, I make them live again.
And they need a home. They need a new home.
They need a new home. If we find a new home for the books, that would be terrific. And if we don't, it will not be the first library that is not in its place. At some point something will happen to it, but whether I will live to see it, I don't know.
Well, thanks very much for...
Okay, I will send you an essay I wrote. I was asked to give the first Hrant Drink lecture in Turkey about the murdered Armenian journalist. And I wrote a little essay on the idea of justice and the consequences of speaking out. I think that might be useful in terms of our discussion, because I don't want you to think that I'm against standing up for what you believe in. All I'm saying is that you have to stand up, but know what will fall as you stand up.
Yeah. I just want Canada to stand as an example to the world, because if we don't, no one will.
But, okay, but of course, but look, when I lived in Canada, I became Canadian because that's what I admired. I admired the possibility that as a private citizen of being able to sit on a school board or to sit in a debate, and this was not just show, things happened.
Yeah, you could make a difference.
You could make a difference, and that was amazing for me, coming from all these other different countries where the only way to make a difference was to throw a stone. I wrote for a number of publications. I wrote for many years for Saturday Night. Saturday Night, under Fulford, was largely a liberal paper, in the, not in the political sense of the word, in the sense that people could give their opinions very freely. And Fulford decided to open it up to extreme right-wing views like those of David Frum. Not only did the paper change completely, the magazine, but it didn't create an open forum. It began adapting itself to those right-wing points of view, because the paradox is, and the great dilemma is, if you are a liberal humanitarian, again, not in the political sense, in the sense of respecting other people's opinions and so on, you're open. You say, okay, you are a neo-Nazi, this is an open forum, you can stand up and speak and give your... But as soon as that shifts into the other camp doesn't have those rules. So you can't do that. You won't have that freedom. All these aspects will be curtailed. And this is what you have to understand in a political arena. Obviously, you want Canada to stand as an example where justice is justice, where everything is open, where minorities are respected. Well, I have sung the praises of Canada so many times that I feel that I'm sort of on a roll when I start with this. But just to say that I am perfectly aware of this. But you have to be aware in what field, in what world you are acting. And if not, you become criminally naive. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate, but that is the reality. And by saying, you stand by your principles and you won't be budged, you affect not only yourself, that's fine, you can turn yourself into a martyr and say, okay, shoot me, I will turn the other cheek, but it affects tons of people who will lose their privileges because of your standing up for justice. It's a paradox that's apparent every day. I'll send you that.
I think she's an example to young Canadians. I do, but...
She could have managed it more intelligently. That's the only thing I'm saying.
Yeah, I think she could have been more pragmatic.
Yeah, not to stand back, but to be more intelligent, to say, okay, I have to stand up for my principles, but I have to do it in a way that won't bring the building down.
Yeah, that keeps me in power. She's lost power.
Absolutely.
Maybe she just figured that there wasn't a way to compromise. I don't know.
Samson does that when he kills the Philistines. Sure, he brings the temple down, but he kills himself at the same time. Is suicide worth every situation of justice and injustice? Is it?
Maybe it is to her.
Maybe it is to her.
Yeah.
Then she carries on her back responsibility for the loss that so many people will endure.
Yeah.
And if she is willing to accept that. In the news, it was yesterday that family burned the indigenous family simply because the fire engine wasn't working in that far-off reserve. She could have made a difference by saying, this is an act of injustice, we have to change it, the responsibility is here and there and so on. She is gone and nobody would say that. Anyway, I'm sorry to become so
Not at all, no. I've been talking to Alberto Manguel. The book is Packing My Library, published by Yale University Press. Thanks so much again for telling your truth.
Thank you. Thank you.